She confessed to sleeping with multiple men. One of them would become king. Days later, doctors would decide she could no longer be trusted with her own mind, and that decision would follow her for the rest of her life. This is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about what happens when truth stops being useful. England, late 19th century. A world built on appearances and sustained by precision, where every visit was announced before it began, every letter sealed in wax before it was sent, and every conversation carried two meanings, one spoken and one carefully hidden. Carriages arrived in quiet succession outside polished townhouses, and behind those doors, reputation was maintained with more discipline than honesty. Reputation was not part of life. It was the structure holding it together. At the center of that structure stood Sir Charles Mordaunt and his wife, Lady Harriet Mordaunt. Their life followed a rhythm that rarely failed. Evenings unfolded in drawing rooms lit by steady lamplight, where servants moved silently along the edges of conversation, and every glance carried meaning. Visits were arranged in advance and confirmed without deviation. Letters traveled between households, written with intention, sealed, delivered, and answered within expectation. Everything had its place. Nothing appeared uncertain, and yet something had already begun to shift. It did not start with conflict. Harriet did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not step outside the boundaries that defined her position. She remained where she was expected to be, but something in her presence no longer fully belonged to the life she was living. She listened, though her replies came a moment too late, as if they had to cross a distance no one else could see. She smiled when expected, but the expression faded before it settled. She stayed in the room while her attention seemed to drift just beyond it, somewhere untouched by the rules that governed everything around her. Charles noticed. He was not a man who ignored patterns. His life depended on recognizing them early and correcting them before they became visible to others, especially in a world where even the smallest irregularity could invite speculation. At first, he allowed for simple explanations. Fatigue, repetition, the quiet weight of expectation that came with maintaining a name. Nothing unusual, nothing that required intervention, until the details began to repeat. A letter, still sealed in wax, folded too quickly when he entered the room. A conversation redirected the moment it approached anything real, replaced with something safer, something appropriate. A pause before answering even the simplest question, as if the answer had to be chosen rather than given. Individually, none of it would have drawn attention. Together it formed something deliberate, and to Charles, deliberate always meant dangerous. He responded the only way he knew how, not with confrontation, but with structure. Evenings arranged more carefully, guests selected with greater intention. The rhythm of their days tightened in ways that would not be visible to anyone outside the house. Instructions were given quietly to servants who understood more than they were meant to show, and movements were noted without ever appearing observed. Control applied precisely. But control only works when it is felt. Harriet did not resist it, and that made it worse. She moved within the structure exactly as expected, without argument, without deviation, and without returning to what she had been before. Nothing openly broke. Nothing repaired itself either. The distance remained, not as conflict but as absence, as if part of her had already stepped outside the life they were maintaining, while the rest continued out of habit, repeating gestures that no longer carried meaning. The house stayed full. The rooms remained lit. Servants continued their routines, doors opened and closed on time, and visitors saw nothing that would give them reason to question what existed beneath the surface. But inside, something no longer held. The tension grew without sound until silence itself began to feel intentional. One evening, that silence reached its limit. The room was still, lit by steady lamplight that left no corner unobserved. Every object stood exactly where it should, every detail correct, every surface controlled. Nothing suggested disorder, and yet the air carried something heavier than it should have, something that could not be adjusted or rearranged. Charles asked a question, carefully and without emotion, the kind of question that usually produces a controlled answer. He expected denial or something close to it. Harriet looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, she was fully present. Not distant, not distracted, but clear in a way that made the moment feel irreversible even before she spoke. She told him everything. She admitted to affairs, not as fragments or half-answers, but with a clarity that left no space for reinterpretation. There was no attempt to soften what she was saying, no hesitation that might have slowed it down. The names followed, and they were not distant or unknown. They were men he recognized, men who had been formally announced at his door, received with courtesy, and seated at his table without suspicion. The space between them changed in a way that could not be undone. Charles did not interrupt. He remained still, listening, not because he accepted it, but because he needed to understand how far it would go. It did not stop where it should have. Harriet continued, and the shift moved from personal betrayal into something far more dangerous. The names no longer belonged only to their social circle. They reached beyond it, toward something that carried consequence simply by being spoken. She said the name of Edward VII, at that time the Prince of Wales, a name that did not belong in a private confession, and certainly not in a moment that offered no protection against what it could cause. She said it without hesitation, as if truth had become more important than survival. Something inside Charles shifted. His posture remained exact, his expression controlled, but the structure he relied on had already begun to fracture. This was no longer something that could be contained within a marriage or resolved through private decision. This was exposure. Not only of actions, but of people who could not be drawn into scandal without consequences that extended far beyond him. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, because control still mattered even if its meaning had begun to change. Losing it would not undo what had been said. It would only make the situation harder to manage. And yet the situation was no longer defined by what Harriet had done. It was defined by what she was willing to say. There was something else, something more unsettling than the confession itself. She was not afraid, not of him and not of what would follow. She spoke as if the act of telling the truth had already separated her from consequence, as if whatever came next no longer had the power to reach her. That was the moment Charles understood the real danger. It was not the affairs, not even the names. It was the loss of control over narrative. Because in his world, truth did not exist on its own. It was shaped, contained, and adjusted until it fit the structure that allowed everything else to remain intact. And Harriet had just removed that structure completely. That night did not end with a decision. There were no threats, no visible reaction, nothing that could be pointed to as the moment everything changed. Only a shift, quiet, controlled, and irreversible. What had been spoken could not remain in its current form, not in a system built on appearance and sustained by silence. And somewhere between that moment and what would follow, a different question began to take shape. Not whether she had betrayed him, but whether she would be allowed to keep telling the truth. Because once truth becomes dangerous, it is not argued with, it is managed. And in that world, management always comes at a cost. The confession did not stay inside the house. It moved the way things always moved in that world, quietly, without being seen. Within days, something shifted. Not openly, not in a way that could be named, but in small, precise changes that carried more meaning than any direct accusation ever could. Invitations that would have arrived without question were delayed. Visits shortened without explanation. Conversations paused just a second too long when a name was mentioned, then redirected with practiced ease. No one asked anything directly. They did not need to. In a society built on observation, silence was often the clearest form of communication. Sir Charles Mordaunt understood what was happening before it fully revealed itself. He could feel it in the rhythm of the days, in the way servants delivered messages with slightly more caution, in the careful neutrality of people who had already begun to adjust their distance. The story was moving, not in full detail, not yet, but enough. Enough to create tension, enough to make his name unstable. At the center of it all remained Lady Harriet Mordaunt. And Harriet was not behaving the way she should have. She did not deny. She did not withdraw into silence. If anything, she became more exposed, more direct. At times, she spoke as if the confession had removed something from her, not added to it. As if whatever had been hidden no longer needed protection. That absence of fear did not calm the situation. It made it dangerous. Because Harriet did not always measure what she said. Details slipped into conversations where they did not belong. Names hovered too close to being repeated. Moments that should have been contained began to take shape outside the privacy of their home, carried in fragments by people who did not fully understand what they were holding. And one name, above all, could not be allowed to move freely: Edward VII. Even unspoken, it was present, in pauses, in glances. in the careful avoidance of certain topics that made the absence itself noticeable. That was when the situation changed. It was no longer a question of scandal. It became a question of containment. Charles began to act, not impulsively, never visibly. He adjusted access first. Fewer visits, more controlled interactions. Invitations declined with polite explanations that revealed nothing. Servants instructed to limit communication, to observe without appearing to observe, to ensure that nothing left the house without passing through a layer of quiet control. At first, it resembled protection. Then it became something else. Letters addressed to Harriet were received, but not always delivered. Messages that would once have reached her directly were filtered, delayed, or answered on her behalf. Even within the house, movement began to follow a pattern that did not belong to her. A structure had been placed around her, and it was tightening. Harriet noticed. Not immediately, not in a single moment, but gradually, the way one notices a change in air before understanding its cause. Conversations ended sooner. Doors closed more often. The presence of others became more consistent, less incidental. She was no longer simply part of the house. She was being managed within it, and she responded in the only way that still remained fully hers, with words. She spoke again. Not loudly, not publicly, but with enough clarity that fragments continued to escape. Pieces of the truth, incomplete but recognizable, carried outward by those who heard them and repeated them in quieter, more cautious forms. Each fragment increased the risk. Because truth, once it begins to move, does not remain controlled for long. Charles understood this. He also understood that exposure was no longer the only threat. Unpredictability had become just as dangerous. And unpredictability in that world demanded a different kind of solution. He began to consult quietly. Not with friends, not with anyone who might treat the situation as personal, with men who understood structure. Lawyers first. Discussions framed not around emotion, but around possibility. What could be proven? What could be denied? What could be redirected into something that preserved order instead of destroying it? Because if this became public in its current form, it would not remain contained. It would expand. And once it expanded, it would reach places where control was no longer his to maintain. But legal strategy alone was not enough. The problem was not only what had happened. It was Harriet herself, her unpredictability, her willingness to speak without calculation, her refusal, intentional or not, to protect the structure that surrounded them. That was when another idea began to take shape, not introduced suddenly, not spoken in a single moment. It appeared gradually through observation, through suggestion, through the careful language of men who understood how narratives could be shifted without appearing to be changed. Doctors. At first, they were brought in under the language of concern, fatigue, emotional strain, the pressure of social expectation. Nothing unusual for a woman in her position, nothing that would attract attention on its own. They observed her, spoke with her, listened. But they were not simply listening to what she said. They were listening for how it could be understood. Harriet spoke clearly. That was the problem, because clarity in the wrong context could be reframed. Her directness became inconsistency. Her honesty became instability. Her lack of fear became something else entirely. Something that could be defined. Something that could be documented. And once documented, something that could be used. The shift was subtle at first. A question asked twice instead of once. An answer noted not for its content but for its tone. A pause interpreted as uncertainty rather than thought. Nothing obvious. Nothing that could be challenged directly. But the foundation was being built. Because if Harriet could be repositioned, not as a woman telling the truth, but as a woman who could not be relied upon to understand it, then everything she had said would change without needing to be disproven. Her confession would not need to be denied. It would simply become unreliable. An unreliable truth carries no consequence. Charles did not resist this direction. He did not need to. It solved the problem without confrontation. It protected names that could not be drawn into open scandal. It replaced exposure with explanation. And most importantly, it restored control. But it came with a cost that could not be reversed. Because once a person is defined in that way, they do not return to what they were before. They are not corrected. They are reclassified. Harriet began to feel the shift, even if she could not yet name it. The way people listened to her had changed. Words that once would have carried weight now seemed to dissolve the moment they were spoken, as if they no longer belonged entirely to her. She had told the truth, but the truth was no longer being received as something stable. It was being examined, interpreted, rewritten. And once that process begins, it does not stop. Because the question was no longer what Harriet had done. The question was whether she could be trusted to know it at all. And that question would decide everything. The case could no longer remain contained. What had moved through drawing rooms and sealed letters began to take form in something far less controlled. A courtroom. Once it entered that space, it stopped being private. It became structure. It became record. It became something that could not be ignored. Sir Charles Mordaunt made the decision in a way that appeared inevitable. He filed for divorce, formally and without hesitation, placing the accusation where it could no longer be managed through silence alone. Adultery. The word itself was expected. The details were not. Because this was not a simple case of betrayal that could be resolved through confirmation and separation. The list of names attached to Harriet's confession did not belong safely inside a legal proceeding. Some of them could destroy reputations. One of them could destabilize far more than that. Edward VII. By then, the Prince of Wales. His presence did not need to be confirmed to be felt. It existed in the restraint of every question, in the precision of every pause, in the awareness that this was no longer just a case between husband and wife. It was something larger. The courtroom filled beyond capacity, not only with observers, but with people who understood exactly what might happen if control slipped even slightly. Aristocrats, legal minds, men who had no official role but every reason to be present. Every seat held attention. Every silence carried weight. Lady Harriet Mordaunt entered that space not as a protected figure, but as the center of it. She was expected to confirm, to deny, to contain. Instead, she remained exactly what she had been from the beginning: clear. The questioning began carefully, measured. Her statements were allowed to settle into the room without interruption, placed into the record with a precision that made them feel stable. At first, then the pattern shifted. A question repeated, a detail revisited. A pause held just long enough to change how the answer would be heard. Harriet responded without hesitation. That was her mistake, because hesitation can be read as doubt, but certainty can be reshaped. The lawyers adjusted, not openly, but with intent. And then it happened. A moment that was not planned to feel significant, but became impossible to ignore. A question was asked again, this time more directly. Its structure tightened just enough to remove any space around it. Not about emotion, not about confusion, about a name. The room did not move. Even the sound of shifting fabric seemed to disappear. Harriet answered, clearly. She repeated what she had already said before, without change, without hesitation, without any attempt to soften it. For a brief moment, nothing happened. No objection, no interruption, just silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in her, in the room. Because the way she had spoken did not align with what had already been built around her. It was too direct, too certain, too controlled. And that made it dangerous in a different way. The response did not come from her. It came from how her answer was received. A doctor, called to observe rather than intervene, was asked to comment. Not on what she had said, on how she had said it. The distinction was small, but it changed everything. He spoke calmly, clinically, describing not the content of her statement, but the manner in which it had been delivered. The certainty he suggested was itself unusual. The lack of visible emotional conflict, the absence of hesitation, the precision of her response. He did not deny her. He reframed her. And in that moment, Harriet understood something. Not fully. Not in a way she could explain, but enough. She looked across the room, at the men who had been listening, at the structure that had been built around her without ever being announced. And for the first time, there was a break, not in her voice, in her position, because she realized she was no longer answering a question. She was being defined by it. Everything she said was no longer moving outward. It was being redirected back at her, measured, interpreted, reassigned. She spoke again, and this time, the words did not land the same way. Not because they had changed, because the meaning had. The courtroom did not reject her. It adjusted around her. Her clarity became rigidity. Her certainty became instability. Her truth became something that required explanation. Charles remained still. Sir Charles Mordaunt did not need to interrupt, did not need to challenge, did not need to force the moment in any direction. It was already moving, away from her, towards something else, toward a version of events that did not need to deny what she had said, only to question her ability to say it. And once that shift happened, it did not reverse. The name of Edward VII remained in the room, but it no longer carried the same weight. Because it was no longer anchored to something stable, it existed inside doubt, and doubt is easier to manage than truth. The rest of the proceedings followed the same pattern: questions that seemed neutral, answers that seemed clear, and a framework that continued to reshape them into something else. By the time the day ended, nothing dramatic had occurred. No confrontation, no collapse, no visible turning point. And yet everything had changed. Because Harriet had walked into that room as someone who knew the truth, and she walked out as someone whose truth no longer belonged to her. The case did not need to prove her wrong. It only needed to prove that she could be. And once that was established, the outcome was no longer in question. It was only a matter of time. The collapse did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything broke, no verdict that felt like an ending. It settled quietly, and once it did, nothing moved again. The court did not need to confirm every detail of Lady Harriet Mordaunt's confession. It chose something more effective. It accepted the interpretation, not of what she had done, but of who she was. The medical assessments, introduced with caution, now carried authority. Observations that once sounded tentative became definitive, and the language shifted from suggestion to classification. Harriet was declared mentally unstable, not in a way that shocked the room, but in a way that made everything else unnecessary. It was enough to remove her authority over her own words, enough to turn every statement she had made into something uncertain, enough to make the truth irrelevant without ever needing to deny it. The room did not react. There was no visible break, no disruption in the controlled atmosphere. Because for those who understood the structure, this outcome made sense. It preserved order. It avoided confrontation. It allowed the most dangerous parts of the story to dissolve without ever being addressed, including the name that had never fully entered the record: Edward VII. He remained untouched, not because the connection had been disproven, but because it no longer needed to be. Once Harriet's reliability was removed, everything she had said followed it. The narrative did not collapse. It reorganized. Sir Charles Mordaunt stood within that reorganization without needing to force it. He did not appear victorious. He appeared stable, measured, aligned with the structure that had resolved the situation in his favor. He did not need to prove more. The system had already done it for him. Harriet remained where she was. But her position had changed completely. She was no longer a central figure in a scandal. She had become something else: a subject, a condition, a problem that required management rather than response. The transition that followed did not draw attention. It happened with the same precision that had defined everything else. Her access to the outside world narrowed. Visits became restricted, then controlled, then almost non-existent. Conversations were no longer exchanges, but observations, and every word she spoke passed through the classification that had just been placed on her. Once that classification exists, it does not loosen. It tightens. She began to understand it not as a decision, but as a reality. Doors that had once opened without question now required permission. Letters that would have carried her voice outward no longer reached their destination. People who had once listened now observed, and even silence was interpreted before it could remain neutral. There was a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when the full weight of it became clear. She was no longer being heard, not because she had stopped speaking, but because her words no longer belonged entirely to her. They passed through something first: a system, a framework that decided what they meant before anyone else could. And within that framework, truth had already been redefined. Harriet could repeat everything she had said, every detail, every name, every moment. It would not restore anything, because the question was no longer whether it was true. The question was whether she was capable of knowing it. And that question had already been answered. The removal from society did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as necessity. A quiet, controlled movement from presence to absence, from participation to observation, from being part of the world to existing outside of it. She was placed under care. That was the word used. It sounded measured, reasonable, almost protective. But it functioned as something else. Isolation, not temporary, not conditional, indefinite. Years did not pass with events. They passed with repetition. Rooms that did not change. Routines that did not shift. Conversations that never moved beyond observation. Time continued, but it did not progress. Outside, the world adjusted. The scandal lost its edges, then its urgency, and eventually its place in conversation. Inside, nothing needed to change, because the system did not require resolution, only maintenance. And maintenance is easier than truth. Sir Charles Mordaunt remained within society, not untouched, but intact. His name stabilized, his position held. The damage had been contained in a way that allowed everything else to continue without disruption. Harriet did not return. Not to the rooms where appearances were maintained, not to the world where silence defined reality. She remained where she had been placed, not because she had nowhere else to go, because there was no structure that allowed her to exist anywhere else. And that was the final shift. Not the loss of status, not the loss of freedom, the loss of definition. She was no longer the woman who had spoken the truth. She was the woman whose truth no longer mattered. And once that happens, there is no reversal. Because the system that made that decision does not admit error, it only continues. Quietly. Exactly as it was designed to do. Time moved forward. It always does. But not for everyone in the same way. For Sir Charles Mordaunt, life settled into something recognizable again. Not unchanged, but stable enough to continue. His name, once close to scandal, found its place within the same structure that had nearly rejected it. Invitations returned. Conversations resumed. The rhythm of society closed around the disruption and held, carefully, efficiently, without leaving anything exposed. The story did not disappear. It changed shape. It became something people understood without repeating, something that lived in pauses rather than words. In drawing rooms, it existed in the way certain names were avoided, in the small adjustments that signaled awareness without requiring explanation. And then, slowly, even that faded. Because society does not hold on to what threatens it. It absorbs it, reframes it, moves on. For Lady Harriet Mordaunt, time did not restore anything. It preserved. She remained where she had been placed, not for months or for a season, but for years that extended into decades. The classification did not shift. The decision did not soften. What had been defined once continued without interruption. She existed within it. Quietly, without influence, without the ability to alter what had already been decided. The world she had once moved through continued without her. The same rooms filled with the same conversations, the same rituals repeated with the same precision, but her place within that structure had been removed completely. Not erased, but replaced. Because something else had taken its place. An explanation. A version of events that allowed everything else to remain intact. And that version did not require her return. The most dangerous detail never needed to be fully addressed. Edward VII would go on to become king. His life continued. Public. Untouched by permanent association with the scandal that had once threatened to reach him. Because the connection had been weakened at its source, not disproven, but made irrelevant. Harriet's confession remained in fragments, documented in parts, referenced in ways that never required full acknowledgement. Enough to exist. Not enough to matter. And that was the outcome the system required. Not clarity, not justice. Stability. Because stability allows everything else to continue without disruption. What makes this story unsettling is not the betrayal itself. It is what followed. A confession led to exposure. Exposure created risk. Risk forced a decision. And the decision did not test the truth. It tested what could be controlled. Harriet spoke with clarity. That clarity did not protect her. It isolated her. Because in a world where truth depends on structure, anything that exists outside of that structure becomes dangerous. And dangerous things are not debated. They are contained. She could have denied it. She could have remained silent. She could have allowed uncertainty to protect her. But she did something else. She told the truth. And that changed everything. Because once she did, the story no longer belonged to her. It moved into the hands of those who could redefine it. Doctors, lawyers, a system that did not need to prove her wrong, only to prove that she could be wrong. And once that distinction is accepted, nothing she says can restore what was taken from her. Her voice did not disappear. It was reassigned, filtered, reduced to something that could be managed without consequence. Years passed, then more. And still, nothing changed. No reversal, no reconsideration, no moment where the system questioned what it had done. Because systems like that do not correct themselves. They maintain themselves. That is how they survive. And that is how this story ends. Not with resolution, not with justice, but with silence that lasted longer than the scandal itself. She told the truth, and that was the only reason she was never allowed to keep it.